Good afternoon, everybody. Let me tell you, I don't know if it's just a beyond the well thing, but scheduling has been one hell of an issue. That's something I've been faced with, like just scheduling conflicts and issues, that things like that have come up ever since this whole platform has existed. But thankfully, things are starting to line up, things are starting to come together, and I finally have my good friend, my old friend. It's been quite some time we've known each other at this point, like probably 5, 6 years. My buddy Connor Good. How you doing?
I'm doing well, my friend. Thank you very much for having me on the platform.
Of course. I mean, when it comes to people who are just wacky, like if you look at the all the people that I've spoken to on here, I've spoken to people from all kinds of different backgrounds. We were just discussing that a second ago. I haven't had the kind of conversations that I've had with you with really anybody else. They just trail off into such bizarre directions, and I'm fascinated by them every single time that they happen.
Well, what's funny for me is when I look back, like kind of like how, our little friendship started, we were both in completely different places in our life, both, philosophically, spiritually, we were just in two different places than we are now. And it was just crazy to see like just how our relationship formed off of just these extreme opposites that you and I held, philosophically. And I think kind of like that's kind of what like drew me towards that friendship, more than other friendships, was just because I felt challenged. I didn't really feel challenged by most friendships, but yours was the one that kind of it took time for me to really think. It wasn't just like I just gave an answer. Like I had to think about it. And that's one of the great things about having a friendship with somebody, is the strengthening of each other through, hard conversations like that. So, it's very interesting because I hearken back a lot on our conversations and just how it's affected me today. I don't know. It's just a really special little friendship you and I have been able to, keep close knit. And, I really do appreciate that the universe has allowed for something like that.
Most certainly, and I think it's sort of fitting as well that we met. I believe the first time, because this goes back to high school some years back. This
Mhm.
is when, and we were. I remember your situation because you were at a Christian school, and the way that they did things was a little funky. It's like
Yeah, yeah,
you were a
yeah.
year older than me, but I think you did kindergarten twice or something like that. So we were a year apart in age, but we were in the same grade, and we actually met, and our friendship began in the journalism newsroom, which I guess it's sort of fitting. Questioning and things like that are supposed to happen in places like that. But I think it was pretty. I'll piggyback off of what you just said. I think it was challenging to me as well to find someone who held different beliefs in at least appearance. But when we actually sat down and spoke to each other, there was an energy present there that made our conversations very fuel. They were very passionate conversations, and we covered all sorts of different topics. I couldn't even I couldn't even recall every single one that we've spoken about because we covered such a large amount of ground.
Oh, I know. It was like, you know, one thing I actually think about a lot is how the people at our table who we would sit with would almost get sucked into what we were talking about. Like they were almost like the spectators of this wild conversation between two juniors in high school, and they're just like, what is going on? And I love that. It honestly felt like you and I were doing a podcast but just in class. And well, because I remember you were into Levian Satanism. Am I correct?
Yeah, at that time I was, yeah.
Yeah, and at that time I would have considered myself a conservative Christian. um and just that right there is just like, oh, how could those two talk? And it's like, no, we had a lot of common ground. And honestly, from those conversations, I discovered myself in a lot of ways. So yeah, that's 100%.
Well, we're both, of course, in our early 20s, and we're still figuring a lot of that stuff out. And I think we're very much in different places now than we were back then. And I think that it's, again, kind of a funny contrast as to how we were separate then and we sort of progressed throughout the years since those days. And of course, with the spectation and the audience and things like that, I actually think there was a few different people at the table that we sat at, and they would get sucked into our conversations. And I believe a few of them actually even said, like, "Oh, you guys should start a podcast or something." And this was like 5, 6 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, and I do look at like, what, you've achieved with your podcast and, just, how impressive that is, just taking, just a platform and some ideas and a conversation and just making something out of that. I have an immense amount of respect for that. And who knows, maybe after this conversation, I'll go out and start my own podcast talking about all the wacky shit that goes on in my head. That'd be a good place to kind of get it out.
Oh, most certainly. I think you have a very much a voice for that sort of thing, even just the way that you speak and pronounce things. I think when you listen to something like whether it be like a lecture in a college classroom or in a high school classroom or even a podcast, one of the things, especially since my conversation with Nicholas, he speaks a lot about the spiritual significance of sound, the way that you communicate messages and the way that the universe or the gods or however you want to interpret that fuel those conversations and fuel those words. And by speaking them, you bring energies and forces to light. And the things that you say have a great significance to them. When you hear someone speak who doesn't speak with a whole lot of confidence, and this is kind of tricky because there are people who know nothing of what they're speaking about, who have no clue as to what they're saying. Those are the ones that often speak the most confidently. But when you get someone who is passionate and who is knowledgeable about the things that they're saying, you can tell and they draw you in, and you very much have that tone of speak. I would say like an authoritative
Right.
speaking tone. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like the human's way of deciphering bullshit from real shit. It's kind of like our own little third eye telling us, like giving us little messages. It's like, I don't know. I've always thought that you can decipher some amount of truth within the way that people speak. Going into speech and talking. I've always felt like once you learn somebody, and even not even knowing the person at all, just having a conversation with them, you kind of can feel if what they're saying is genuine or if it's just trying to put on a persona. And for me, that's taken time just to understand people, understand, my own life and my own struggles, and kind of, that's how I've learned to communicate with people. Like, if that makes any sense. I feel like I'm trailing off a little bit, but
This don't even worry about it. We trail off here. That's what we do.
all right,
That's
good.
where the most fascinating conversations take place. And that's sort of what tends to happen. You start with one thing and it branches off into a whole bunch of other things. And most
Definitely, yeah.
yeah, as far as like deciphering the truth behind someone, as speaking with a confident tone or sounding at least like you know what you're talking about will stimulate those senses in somebody. They'll want to research and listen to what you actually have to say. And I
Right,
think
yeah.
as far as expertise goes, you've gone in a very different direction from the as you put it, the conservative Christian
Mhm.
person that I knew at that point back then. And I always, even back then, I found it fascinating that the conservative Christian dude loved punk music, knew quite a bit more about black metal than I thought he would. Like even back then, there were some seeds that were being laid there that hopefully I was hoping at least back then would be watered a little bit just to see what would happen.
Yes, yes. No, that watering definitely took place with that. Yeah. Uh change has been taking place tremendously on both of our parts. Um and one thing I like to harken back on is the times in our friendship where we kind of came to a crux, where like you believe one thing and I believed another thing, and we had, those hard conversations. And a lot of them were, I would say, somewhere in the political realm. I would say kind of floated there. But one thing that I found just so tremendous was that we were able to have that difficult conversation and still be on opposite poles, but still be able to maintain a respect for one another, you know? And I think that, I mean, from where you're at in life, and where I'm at in life, I feel like we have more commonality than we did when we were in high school. It's just at this point we've kind of just all, just accumulated all this different experience and all this different, all the different things that shape us. And we're both here right now at at a place where I really appreciate, the commonalities that we have now that I don't think we had in high school, which kind of helped strengthen our relationship in my view.
That's very much a view that's, traded. I definitely feel that as well. I think when it comes to when you deal with something I've noticed, especially as of late, when I say as of late, I mean the past couple of years, I've undergone a pretty tremendous in terms of like spirituality. I've undergone quite a significant change over the past several years, even going back to when we first met.
Mm-hmm.
My interests back then were a lot more juvenile and a lot more fueled with insecurity and anger. And that was very much shown in, I think, the LaVeyan philosophy, if you even want to call it that, because most of it's plagiarized anyway.
Yes. Yeah.
So if you even want to call it that, that's what a lot of it is fueled by, insecurity and anger. And I think for a 16-year-old kid who was pissed off at the world, and of course that's gonna fit just fine. But as I got older, and I think you can mirror this as well, you start discovering once that anger and that insecurity starts to become more, you become more aware of it, and it starts to fade a little bit. You
Right.
start to want to hunger to be a little bit more compassionate, and that led me in a completely different direction. I was ultimately sort of flip-flopping on your side for quite some time, like trying to figure out like who is this Jesus person. I was raised with some knowledge about it, but I didn't really understand it for myself.
Right.
And I think that can be mirrored in the political realm as well, because ultimately anything that you say can be construed as a political statement to some degree, but it always goes deeper, and that's what I'm more fascinated by: is how much deeper does this go into? Is this a beyond just a political issue, because that has its own connotation? Does this have something to do with human rights? Does this have something to do with whether someone can eat or survive today? Like that, those are the conversations I think when you escape the political realm, really just that term and all the connotations it has,
Right.
and
Right.
you look at the issue itself, it becomes a matter of, am I willing to help this guy out? Am I willing to help this woman out? Am I willing to help this group of people out? There's no need to put a political label on it. Just because that's the sphere that those conversations tend to occur in doesn't mean that that's what it's confined to.
Right. And it's funny today because so many of these issues that are inherently human issues get rounded up as political issues. So you're no longer talking about humans, you're making it politics. You're making it about, bureaucracy. You're making it about, legislation.
You're making it about business.
You're making it about business. And humans are not business. Humans are worthy of more than that. Um, so when you kind of get out of this mindset of like, businessmen in suits, politics, briefcases, all this shit that you think, for me, I want to take it into a direction where it's like, okay, what's a direct action that I can do right now that can directly benefit the people around me? And especially the people who are suffering, like what can I do right now that's going to directly benefit? It's like there's so much that you can do to help people. Like maybe in the grand scheme of things, there's not a whole bunch that we can do, but in this moment right now, like here, like, where we are right now, there are things that we can do to help people, and it just takes a little bit of thought, you know, and what I have kind of grown to realize in the past year, I mean, year and a half, 2 years, I mean, it's been some seed sowing, but really the takeoff happened like about a year ago. But once I started getting spiritually connected with the world around me and thought of things not out of the perspective of my own eyes, but of the eyes of the world, as crazy as that may sound, like I started to, it broke down a lot of barriers that I had in my head where I didn't think spirituality could fit into them. And then once I got to that point, I realized that all of these things that we believe in, we can put into direct action in the now. And that is makes someone feel for me, I mean, for me personally, that brought me a tremendous amount of peace because I was no longer hopeless. Hopelessness for me was, something that, totally completely dragged me down. And once I discovered that you can do something to benefit others in any way possible, like that just brought me a tremendous amount of joy. And once that
That's
realization comes, for me, it's like you have to constantly water it every day, because if you let it, if you let that crop wither, you're just going to go back to having, the dry, arid land that you had before.
absolutely. And I think that what you just said was a very critical point too. When you subtract the ego and you look at what you say you believe through a critical lens and you break it down into terms of what can I do today, right now, tomorrow, this week, this month even. When you break it down to that sort of level, that's really when it becomes a spiritual system. I've regaled plenty of times about the corporatization of Christianity, for example, being Americans. We see that the most. Although it is practiced differently in other cultures, I think that system, if you look at the system itself, like the book that's written about it, the way that it's structured within our country, you can see how people get lost in the, how you put it, the bureaucracy of the whole thing. It's almost very similar to how the political realm is actually functions. It's a hierarchy. You listen to this person tells you to do this thing, and you follow these rules, and
Mm.
that's supposed to stand for a spiritual system. But even deeper than that, and I've studied all kinds of different spiritual systems out there, from Buddhism to paganism to all these different systems. And all of them boil down ultimately into what you just said. How can I help someone today? That is such a crucial part of it, is that camaraderie, that spirit of giving, that spirit of subtracting the ego from what you say you believe, because the ego has a really has an incredible way of taking something and polluting it and rotting it essentially, to where
Oh,
ultimately it's not even a spiritual system anymore. It's just something that you say you believe when really you don't do much of anything at all to back that up.
oh yeah. Well, it's so funny because it's like when you dissolve your, I mean, like when you talk about like dissolving the ego, it's such a like it's such a it's almost like a nirvana place to be. Like that's like the enlightenment, like when you totally like dissolve your ego. I personally like struggle with ego every single day. Ego is something that like really, if I let it like just keep on ruling my life, it'll ruin my life. And for me, what helped with dissolving my ego, and this is it sounds like a very kind of like a cheater's way to spirituality, but it worked for me. And I know now that I'm a better person from it, is from my use of psychedelics. Psychedelics have drastically shaped my view of the world, have drastically changed how I see people, how I try and live my life, how I see things. And for me, it's had a tremendous benefit on my life personally. I know there's plenty of people who, have very, very bad experiences with it. And, I have all the respect in the world for that. But from me and my experience, it has done a lot of good for my life.
I think you can boil that down to perspective. It really has no different. It's no different than approaching a ritual or a working of some kind. When you have the perspective that I definitely think that you have this inherent interest in the spiritual realm, an inherent interest in the things that go beyond the world that we live in. You look up at the sky and you just sit there and wonder as to what is really going on here. What else is there? You have this inquisitive mind. And if you take that and you pair it with something which can definitely liberate you in some sense, even though there's plenty of work to do outside of that, whether it be through study, meditation, other workings, what have you. When you approach psychedelics or something like psychedelics, and I'm speaking as someone who hasn't had a whole bunch of experiences with them, but I definitely intend to at some point in my life. When you approach it with that perspective, you get out of it what you go into it with. If
Mm.
you go into an experience like that, and I have my own experience through other means of spiritual experience, but if you approach it with this intention of I want to gain something from this, when you approach it with a very egotistical standpoint, like what is this going to give me?
Mm.
What do I want from this? When you approach it with this selfishness, all that's going to do is outline all of the selfishness and the rot and the ego that is just waiting inside of you to be let out. You're going to see the ugliness. It's going to embrace you in a way that you couldn't have ever imagined it could.
Oh, 100%. And the funny thing about acid is that sometimes it's not even your choice. how you go into it. I've had plenty of times where, I go into it with a mindset, and I want to get something out of it. And acid says, no, we're going to show you something else. We're going to go a different route. And it has shown me very interesting things. It's definitely opened my mind up. And then there's been many times where I go into it with a very intensive purpose to get something out of it. And, it gives me what I put into it. But the first time that I really had a breakthrough with LSD, was when I took it in a party sense. I hadn't taken anything like that since I was like in high school. So this was like a first time in a long time that I had taken this. And it was in like this pool party sense. And I took it and I completely did a 180 of what I came there to do. I came there to, party, to get disoriented, to, yada, yada, whatever. And I ended up ending the night completely. My life was completely changed. It was almost like this spiritual force was guiding the evening. I came across, it was almost like in one evening, I came across so many beautiful and evil things that it was just like I saw the entire duality of life in one evening. And that's how it felt when I was on, the drug at the time. And I very much believe that there was something higher up guiding that trip, because it was almost like you're opening up your mind to something bigger, something greater, inviting that energy to, you use it as a compass kind of to guide you. But yeah, it's different for every person. For me, it hasn't always been my choice what it is and what it manifests itself to be, which is kind of scary, but it's almost like, kind of putting your trust in it in a way, and asking yourself if you're ready to kind of take that dive.
Well, that was something that I definitely wanted to ask and get some more insight on, is how it affected you. I had a conversation with a buddy of mine who I hope to one day speak on with this topic with in this platform as well. And so I won't go into too much incredible detail, but essentially what wound up happening with him, he dropped DMT. And he was this is someone that I met in a work environment who was never too spiritual, if you want to put it that way. He was very interested in philosophy and kind of studying spirituality, but from an outsider's perspective. You know what I mean? He
Right.
wasn't someone who was actively involved in it. But with this experience, like, he came out of it, and I saw him a couple weeks after this experience at a party as well. And we were just hanging out, just drinking, having a good time. And that was when he told me about this experience. He's like, "Yeah, I definitely believe in gods now."
Mm-hmm.
It's like, yeah, there's definitely there's an afterlife. There is all these. I'm sitting here listening to this, like, what do you mean? And that was what led into him telling me that story. He essentially he saw the figure of the Baphomet, and he met this deity and had a conversation with it, like under the influence of this. And it was just such a radically life-changing event for him. And I'd like to ask you, what kind of experiences, if you're open to speaking about them, what kind of experiences have you had that have changed your perspective, like just with tripping or whatever substance that you happen to be using?
Well, I mean, like one of the big ones that come to my brain would be the one where I had taken my first hit of acid in a really long time and had one of the greatest nights of my life. That whole evening was just it. It was a very divinely appointed evening. I kind of like to tell people about it, and people think it's funny that an evening like partying like that can turn into something so spiritual. And I'm just like, that's just the way of LSD for some reason. But no, I ended up meeting the daughter of Townes Van Zandt, the folk singer. I don't know if you are aware of his music, but his music has, changed my life incredibly. He's one of my favorite songwriters ever. And I was talking with this girl, talking about Townes Van Zandt just out of nowhere. Like, we just got into a conversation about Townes Van Zandt, and all of her friends around her are, laughing and stuff. And I'm like, oh, what's going on? And a guy says, that's Townes Van Zandt's daughter. And I like lost my shit. I was like in tears, just thinking that I had met God. Like, I had met one of my idol's daughters, and we had a huge conversation, and it was awesome. I met just tons and tons of people that I, really don't remember, but I remember more their energy that I shared with them in the moments that I had those conversations with them. As I felt just so inherently connected to everyone in the room, every energy, every, just person felt so alive, and, makes you feel like you're a part of something bigger. So in those moments, you just talk to everything, you try to get around everything like as much as you can, just to like almost absorb its energy. And that's like, it was just like, that night was like the epitome of that. It was just incredible. um there have been other times where I've taken stronger things like DMT. um and the thing with DMT and me is I either have no trip at all, or I like completely just go headfirst into the hole. Um, I don't know if it's been, what I've, gotten has been, fake or not good. And the times that I have tripped have been, great. But that's just kind of like the trend of it for me. So, but the funny thing about that is, even if I didn't trip while smoking the DMT, it still gave me a very open perspective on things. And it kind of almost, I felt like my brain had been heightened. Like I felt more aware of things, like things almost things smelt sweeter, and like was more pungent aromas. You could see things clearer. So I personally am a really big believer in DMT being a incredibly spiritual property, that can be used for incredible and be used in incredibly beneficial ways. I mean, it's been evident in, Native American culture, shamans, witch doctors. I mean, it's a very well-known plant, or the plant is ayahuasca. DMT comes from ayahuasca. Um, and I don't know, I really do believe that DMT is an incredibly beneficial and useful tool to be used at one's own discretion, because it's very, very fucking heavy.
So I've heard. It's sort of like it echoes that same sentiment of like it's this little joke thing. I'm sure you've heard. Everybody's heard it. I think it's the what if when you take substances like that, what if we take psychedelics? That's the world as it actually is, and we're actually the ones who are high or tripping all the time without it. And it's sort of, I think there is some sort of truth to that though, because when you look at when you would take this substance and you are able to look at the world around you and see the interconnectivity that you have to it, those things are there all the time, but it simply outlines it. It strips away all the ego, it strips away all the distractions, it strips away all your fears and all your insecurities, and you get to look at things as how they are, which is a principle behind meditation. Like a lifelong practice of meditation is being able to view the world as it actually is, as opposed to what you are interpreting it as being. Which, if you look at the world as it actually is, we are interconnected to everybody. And this ties right back around to what we were saying at the beginning of this whole thing, which is when you look at issues that the world is facing and you are able to bog it down to its most simple components, in that this is a human rights issue. You become aware of things like that when you are able to view the world through such lenses, stripping
Mhm.
away your interest in these things, stripping away how you are able to gain something from it. When you start looking at things that way, and spiritual practice, this is a core component of it in the first place, is being able to see how you are connected to the world around you.
Oh, 100%. And I kind of want to go back to the meditation thing that you were talking about, because once I started meditating, I started meditating at a retreat that I went on, a self-help retreat, when I was younger. That kind of gave me like the basis of what meditation was. Never really practiced it at all until later on, after my, really, substantial experience with LSD. I kind of picked it up again and kind of found my own way with meditation, and realized that, you very well can achieve the similar mindsets that you get when on LSD or DMT, um, just for meditating. There are ways for you to achieve that mindset completely naturally. If you look at the DMT molecule, it's a naturally occurring thing in all humans. We all have it. It's a part of our DNA. It gets released during sleep and when you die. So I do believe that if you were to focus yourself and get yourself into a place of complete meditation, complete tranquility, that you can access DMT in your brain completely naturally. And that's something that, I mean, I have not been able to get to that place, but I've been able to get to a place where I can meditate and feel completely connected like I would on a hallucinogen.
It's funny that you mentioned that you say it that way because I just had a conversation with a friend of mine who's been on the podcast before, Barker Witch tattooer Pat, for those who know him. We were talking recently when he came down here to visit, and he was speaking about his experience with like some psychedelic stuff that he had taken. I don't know specifically what, but he said, he's like, he had been practicing meditation for a long time. And it's sort of that same principle of, I'm taking this thing, and he's sitting there and he's in the middle of a trip and he's like, oh, I've been here before. It's like, oh, this is like, I've experienced this before during meditation or after, or just the effects, the mindset that you get yourself set in. Like, oh, I've already experienced this before. I've felt this before. This isn't alien to me. And the whole conversation was tied around how, like you said earlier, these substances can sort of act as a cheat. I don't know if you want to put it that way, but sort of like a cheat code that you implement, and now you're in this
Yeah.
place. Yeah, as
Yeah,
opposed
yeah.
to
Go ahead.
oh no, it's all you.
Well, yeah. So, when I actually called it a cheat code, I almost felt like I was kind of like kicking it off the pedestal it does deserve to be on. Because I mean, it can be used as a cheat. You know, like there's people who think that, you know, the secret to life is hidden within a hit or a gel tab or a fucking tea. You know, like you totally lose the substance of spirituality when you put it all into a substance. You know, it's no longer a spiritual property. It's just another drug to get high off of. And that's completely not what LSD is for. I mean, it's great, you know, but there's so much more to get out of it, you know, except that. And I know people who have actually had psychedelic like experiences, like close-eyed visuals and, you know, all that good stuff, you know, from being in a very deep state of meditation. And I really love that idea. Like I love the idea that you can obtain, you know, the kingdom of heaven, you know, if you shall call it, just within yourself. You know, like it's in all of us, you know, and it's like if one person can do it, if one person can find tranquility from looking in within themselves and being completely whole with that, like then it is obtainable, you know, for everybody. You know, and that's how I personally view it.
And that's a central tenet as well to the whole popular conception of the left hand path, like whether it's historically verifiable or not, like that particular perception of it. It's looking inward rather than outward to find your spiritual belonging, to pave your own path by looking inward, because it does work and operate differently for everybody. I think that's a good segue into how these substances and use of them, if they at all inform the spiritual path that you claim now. We've had private conversations where we've spoken about different things like Gnosticism and different interpretations of spirituality. But I was curious as to how you would describe and explain that, having had these experiences and having woken up, so to speak. You don't want to use that terminology too much, but how does this inform where you are now? And in fact, where are you now?
Well, when it comes to, I mean, so first off, I would like to say that I have personally, like for other people, I think that religion can be an incredibly useful tool for their lives. I know many people who hold religion in a very, you know, sacred place in their life, you know, and that's awesome. But for me, the most part of religion is control. Religion for me is controlling people. It's controlling people by an ideology, you know, the threat of death, and all the things that you commonly find within religion don't actually have roots in love. For me, when I see kids in Sunday school singing songs about, you know, loving Jesus or having to go to hell, that doesn't sound like love to me. That sounds like indoctrinating one into submission, you know. And I personally, for me, believe that the figure of Jesus Christ is an incredibly influential, uh, you know, figure for me. He always has been since I was a kid. I mean, you grow up with that, and I've found a way to kind of incorporate, you know, Jesus Christ and his teachings and the way he lived his life, and kind of not so much as a compass, but more as like a mentor, because when you really look at who Jesus Christ was, he's not the person that conservative America is going to tell you about. They tell you the things about Jesus that fit what they want to do, what, the messages they want to get across. When if you actually look at who Jesus Christ was, he had a lot of principles that actually would not align with many modern day Christians. And one could even argue that a lot of his views were socialist. And I mean, that's a whole different conversation. But for me, looking at that perspective of who Jesus was, such a danger to, control and religion and society that they had to put him on a cross. I mean, that right there is inspiration. That right there, like, gives me, like, fuel to be a truth teller, and I would like to think at any cost, I would like to get to that place, but I want to be one of those people that is able to speak the truth, like, at all times, be that kind of Jesus person, so to speak. But on the political spectrum, I also like to bring in spirituality with that. And I like to incorporate a philosophy of anarchism, which really kind of focuses on the power within an individual, the autonomy of the individual to do what they will with their own lives and make of it what they will. That has a lot of definitely a lot of influence on how I view the world as well. So, and it's kind of hard being able to juggle, the political with the spiritual. I still have, trouble with that. But the best thing that I always harken back to is just where my heart was at and where my mind was at when I was either in a really deep state of meditation, really tripping on acid or on a hallucinogen, or harking back to a time when I was really, really happy. That's what kind of realigns, recenters me. It's like, okay, how would I view this person if I was on acid? How would I view this situation? And you can harken back on it. You're like, oh, wow, this would, be way different. I'd probably view this completely differently. This would, be either good or bad, or, or none of the above, so I don't know. It's such a transformative substance, and it's taken me to places that I didn't really know existed because I wasn't able to achieve that in, the Christian church. So I acquaint that substance as being like my big starter for spiritual living.
I think you made a good point as far as like morality goes. Like, how would I view this situation if I was in this state of mind, as you put it? Because it goes so much deeper than that. It's not just a matter of I'm high right now, therefore I see. No, it's how would I view the situation if I was in a different place, if I was thinking differently, more clearly, however you want to put it. And I did like that you stated as well that what you see in the corporate, I call it corporate Christianity, because I think that's ultimately what it is. If you look at the doctrines, it very much supports a philosophy that is not backing love. It's not really about that. You don't love someone by saying you accept them and then telling them to change themselves. I think that's a great mirror for that is the LGBTQ stance, or the issues that they've had with one another. You can't say you love someone, and this is an issue I tend to have with modern churches, like the more liberal swinging ones here in like California and whatnot. I don't know how it's like the rest of the country, but they tend to put on this very shiny, fashionable, clean looking, like clean shaven face and a smile and say, hey, come join us, we love you, we love you. And then once you actually join them, you see that their ideology is in it. For the example of someone who's in that LGBTQ community, you don't love someone by accepting them and then telling them they need to change, or reinforcing an ideology that says who you are at your core is wrong. Who
Mm,
you are at your core is going to condemn you to hell. That's not love. That's not love at all. You don't approach love that way. Love is an accepting thing. It's full, total acceptance. And if you say you love someone, but you hold this ideology above their heads like that, or it's something that you deeply believe, I don't know if you truly can love them to the extent that you say they do. And that's kind of the issue that I have with the overall church and even with Christ's teachings himself. But if you take a look at it, like the way that you've explained it, if you take a look at it from the more Gnostic perspective of Christ as a teacher, instead of being the one true God that the corporate Christianity kind of pushes. If you look at the Gnostic teachings, it's quite a bit different. And what you've said is a lot more in line with them. It's a lot more of a spiritual, mystical way of living, way of expressing yourself spiritually than you find in a modern Christian church, if you want to put it that way, because they do tend to operate on entirely different perspectives on things like love, acceptance, gratitude, and missionary and doing stuff like that.
right.
Completely different perspective.
Right. It's funny that you bring up missionary, because I had taken a course in Australia with this. I mean, I like to call it a company. It's called YWAM, Youth with a Mission. It's this big thing. They go all over the world and go to places that few people have been to preach Christianity. And going there was one of the big points where I had wanted nothing to do with Christianity as a religion. I felt very disturbed by the way that they went about telling people about Christianity. It was almost like they would use that culture's lack of, I guess, like semblance to a god, because some cultures, like there's some places that don't have a god. They just don't, and they bring Christianity over as kind of like a way to almost colonize, and I was also not comfortable with just going up to random people on the street, bothering them for no reason and just assuming that they wanted to take 15, 20 minutes out of their day to talk about Jesus and be prayed on for an insane amount of time. Like just praying on somebody in the middle of the street. It just felt crazy to me. It felt nothing of what love is. It was almost like, oh, I'm doing this because I love you. I want to save you from hell. You're not going to hell, if I can save it. And essentially it's not our job. It's not our job to save people from eternal damnation. No one's going to save you. No one's going to save your soul. That's for your own doing, and I always felt that, and I always was getting into contradictions with the people there, and just causing a whole fucking ruckus there because I was miserable. I was just, there was a point where I was just like, fuck it, I don't want to be here anymore. And I was all the way in Australia. So I had made a huge commitment for 3 months of my life to learn how to indoctrinate cultures into Christianity. And that was really just the tipping point for me with Christianity, and how I view missionaries as a whole. I don't know. It's just I met so many nice people at the program. There's the people there, trying to be, missionaries were, good people at the core. I just felt that like they were just so misguided, and they were almost letting themselves be brainwashed by, colonial Christianity, is basically what it is. So I don't know. The whole experience just put a really bad taste of Christianity as a religion in my mouth, and to this day, that's still really where I stand with it.
It's fascinating that you put it that way too, because there was I think a documentary or an interview that I listened to about Scientology,
Yeah.
and you essentially see the same thing within Scientology. Like a lot of the lower level people in the church, and I've met them. I went to one of their events, which is a story I'd love to get into at some point. Um, that was a fun time. I've been to in Los Angeles. They have their big headquarters out there. I went to the giant blue church with the big old massive cross on it that glows at night. I went to the L. Ron Hubbard life exhibit that they have there too. So I've met these people, I've spoken to them, and I find a lot of similarities in, you know, these people who are good. The whole driving force behind Scientology is that the principles that L. Ron Hubbard wrote in his books, this is going to save the world. We are saving the world, and that very quickly can get into the ends justify the means sort of thing. If you convince someone that they're going to save the world, they're willing to do almost anything for that. They're willing to commit, and I'm not saying or painting everybody that follows like Christianity, for example, or goes on mission trips, or even the lower level Scientologists. I don't equate them at all with like atrocities and
Right.
committing things like that. But that's how you get things like that to happen, was by convincing someone that they are fighting and willing to die for a higher purpose. And it's that parallel to me at least stood out. But yeah, you do find a lot of people who are genuinely decent people who are believing and preaching things that are not so much. Again, is this really love? If you're threatening someone with damnation, is that really love there? And I think those are very important questions to ask, especially if someone who's convinced that this is the absolute truth and they're willing to die for it.
Right. And and a lot of the time I've noticed that they think that it's so true and it's so infallible that it's not even worth questioning, you know? Like, you know, this is something that I've just been taught and just programmed to believe, you know, it to the point where you don't question it at all, where even questioning seems like a taboo. You know, it cuts off circulation for any critical thought. And if you take that idea and look at, you know, various cults, religions, sects, you know, things like that, you'll see that same kind of, you know, brainwashing happening. It's such an infallible truth that, you know, it'd be heresy.
And that's an important note to make as well. If you look at the Abrahamic religions, and this applies to cults as well, if you want to use that term, because it has that cults, it's very hard hitting. But
Yeah, yeah,
one of
yeah.
the principles behind that is not being able to question. If you look at, and again, not speaking about the followers, but I'm speaking about the system as a whole, the doctrine. You want to look at like Islam, they have the apostate thing, where people are brought into the streets and have their heads hacked off for being apostates, for questioning the government. And a lot of times within systems like that, especially in the Middle East, those instruments like the whole Sharia law thing, that's used by the government to control populations of people with this threat of violence. Not just so much don't question our religious system, but don't question us, because we're the ones in power, we're the ones controlling things, and we don't want you stepping out of line. And that was
Essentially,
seen,
they make
yeah,
them God.
and that was seen as well in medieval Europe with Christianity. You want to talk about colonialism? What was the primary driving force behind that, and what was used to colonialize different
Mhm.
nations? It's the
Fear.
Bible and sword.
Right. Right. It's a pillaging, you know, violence. Um, you know, all of these things make for perfect brainwashing and, you know, perfect subordination. And that same idea of, you know, taking something that's not yours is kind of what I feel is a large component of religion. It's almost like stealing people's inhibition to, you know, make a life for themselves and stealing them away for, you know, the bigger purpose of the religion, corporation. You know, I mean, I equate a lot of things to, you know, religious establishments to corporations. You know, they make just as much money. I
If
mean,
not more.
if not more. Yeah, exactly. It's just, oh man, I just sometimes talking about it just gets me flustered. You know, growing up in a family where this was all just so like relevant, you know, it's almost like, you know, just saying things and like, you know, just shit flashes before your eyes, you know. It's a mild form of PTSD, I swear.
I very much feel you on that one, and it's not at all casting aspersions on those that raised me or I was around, but the ideology itself is what does that. When you and George Carlin has talked about this plenty. Anybody who hasn't somehow heard of him or listened to what he's had to say, you should do that.
Oh, he's wonderful.
You should definitely do that.
Wonderful man.
But he spoke about that a lot. How it's, especially with children, it's like a child abuse thing. And this
Mhm.
applies to all religions under that banner, who are telling them that you need to do X, Y, or Z, or this bad, bad, bad thing is going to happen to you.
XYZ DIE. That's basically what it is.
That was a great way to put it. Exactly. And that's the functioning mechanism behind all of it. And I think that's important to note as well, kind of the difference, at least to me, when I think about what separates like a pagan community who's self-sustaining as opposed to like a corporate like Christian or Abrahamic religion. I could put it that way. In a corporate Abrahamic religion system,
Right.
and ultimately, I think it comes down to dogma and how that dogma is enforced.
Mm.
You look at a bunch of smaller groups, and especially here in America, things like Hinduism and Buddhism. I had the pleasure of attending some meditation classes at a Buddhist monastery not too far from me, and I see that a lot of that uh, philosophy is starting to boom here, really since the 60s and 70s, like the hippie era. What separates them is how they enforce their dogma, or if they even have a dogma at all. Like, you have these ultimately benign systems of people that aren't going out and telling people that they're going to be condemned to some place or another for doing this or living this way or marrying someone of the same sex or gender or however you want to put it. Like, that's ultimately what separates them, is they're not condemning or hurting people in the name of this thing they say they believe.
Right, right. Well, it's also the like, you know, sharing of the common belief, you know, the common good of one another. You know, it's it almost kind of takes away from some of the confusion, you know, because they're all like in that common belief, you know, of the pagan deity, you know, and not even the deity, but more of just like the worshiping of the world around them, you know, the trees, the land, you know, like kind of the belief that all things breathe, you know, like that's where they stood with it, you know, and they didn't need to be, you know, controlled because, you know, it was all you know, consensual, you know, it was all, you know, under their, you know, yeah, like, you know, we're going to do this. Whereas religion almost like subjugates people. It takes, and I mean, like back to what I was saying, like, you know, their inability to think for themselves, you know, and kind of shapes them in a way that puts them as the next perfect cog in their giant machine, you know, and they're constantly looking for new cogs. The more cogs they got, the more, you know, intricate it is, you know, I mean, the more it works to their benefit.
And the more power they have and the more resources they have, it kind of comes down to this base instinct of trying to gather as much together to ensure your survival, despite the fact that you're subjugating millions of people, which is often the case. And I think this is an important question too, and it just came to my head. In addition to the dogma being something that separates like a legitimate spiritual system and experience that millions of people like are under in the form of like Abrahamic religions, is
Mm.
also the individual. Because I don't think I grew up in, you know, the corporate like Christian system as well, and there's definitely good parts of it, not at all dismissing that, but the
Mhm.
emphasis that I find in other systems like with Hinduism and Buddhism, it's not just a matter of community is important, but you're a part of that community based on your own individual spiritual experience and your own individual work, your own individual insight. You won't find a whole bunch of Buddhists. Like, you can walk into like a Catholic church, for example. There's probably, if you walk into one of the big ones where there's like hundreds of people there, if not thousands,
Mm.
maybe half, and that's being generous, maybe half of, if not a little bit more, will actually be able to sit there and have a conversation about what they say they believe, about scripture, about like who Jesus was, the Old Testament. Like, you won't find the same level of understanding there as you would find in a pagan or a Buddhist society, a community, because they're there because the groups are so much smaller. You're led there by your own individual experience, and you have to put in the work much more so than you do. You can't just passively be a Buddhist. It's really hard to
Yeah,
do.
right.
You can't just passively be one. And I can reflect on and I think you can definitely have something to say about this too. um I look at my own personal like spiritual experiences, like, and I was just I can count on one hand how many I've had in my whole life. Like, genuinely, there are other forces here with me, spiritual experiences, and every single one of them happened when I was alone. Every single one. They've
Mm.
all happened when I was alone, when I was isolated, at least to some degree, and I could not possibly in those moments have felt more connected to the world around me and understand that there is in fact something greater going on here. I've never had any experiences like that in a building with 500 other people. And I know some say some can and some do, But for me, the individual experience is such a core part of building a spiritual system.
You know, it's funny you say that, because oh man, when you were saying something, it brought my mind to a time when I was at my first rehab, which was a wilderness rehabilitation course, and one of the like kind of one of the stepping stones of the program, like that kind of gets you to, you know, the next level of, you know, almost completing, you know, the course, is 72 hours of complete solitude, complete fasting, you know, no eating. I mean, we could drink water, of course, but you know, it was 3 days of, you know, no one, nothing, just yourself. And that is when, personally for me, I've had probably my most significant spiritual experience, um, not under the influence of any type of mind altering substances. Um, it was like, it was the first time that I realized that everything that is living shares a commonality, and every living thing is made of essentially the same things that we're made of, like atoms. You know, like we're all basically made of the same shit, you know? And that's a big thing for me that I think should bring people together, you know, is more of a thing that, like, you know, there's so much in common with us, you know, there's so much that we can share together, you know. And you know, a lot of people get so stuck in, you know, differences and things like that. And this was just like, you know, just a whole bunch of realizations that I was having in this moment, you know. um and yeah, that was kind of just like my, like, one of my really big experiences, you know, finding you know, a spirit, a presence, you know, a whatever, you know, you'll call it, you know, something with a higher knowledge, you know, than you. And that's always been a really significant part of my life. I always harken back on it. You know, I'm very, very grateful to have had that 72 hours, you know, as hard as it was. You know, it definitely planted yet another seeds in my spiritual garden, so to say.
And I think that again, you can look at another more private conversation that we had about culture and about cultural appropriation and kind of like how that would work or what that looks like, or is this even a thing? Like conversations that need to be had.
Right.
And one of the things that I remember saying during that conversation was what I found to be so inspirational about like a lot of these pagan cultures and pagan groups and these native, like you're seeing right now, we're seeing like an explosion all over the world and people reviving their ancient ancestral roots and looking at their heritage and where they come from and looking at the gods of their folk and the gods that are like inherently within them. This is where you come from. I think what a beautiful principle to look back, reflect on, and kind of close out on is that even beyond that, even beyond your cultural heritage, the differences that we do have, whether by ethnic region or wherever you fall under, we are even beyond that made of the same stuff. We're made of the same energy. We come from the same lands. We are all we are all entirely subsistent off of what I call Earth's blood, the water that we drink, the food that we eat. We all are made of the same stuff. We all, beyond cultural heritage, beyond political differences, beyond family ties, beyond the ego, we are all made of the same stuff. Without those integral ingredients that make up who we are, ego wouldn't exist, your heritage wouldn't exist, and who you are wouldn't exist. So it goes even deeper than that.
Oh, it's like it's so funny. Like when I hear people say that their ancestry, you know, doesn't matter, you know, like, you know, your bloodline doesn't matter, you know, and I can totally understand the argument for it not mattering, you know, with the whole, you know, supremacy and, you know, a culture, a group of people thinking they're better than one another. But it's really important to look back on where you came from, you know, where your roots are, you know, like what has, you know, basically created you, it's like, where does your blood come from, you know? And I think that understanding that and understanding, you know, where you come from is integral for, you know, understanding yourself and understanding what makes you tick, what makes you do what you do, and also, what connects us all, because essentially we all come from, the same place. If you want to look at it at a very, spiritual plane, we all come from one direct force. We're all a part of that one direct force. And I think just keeping that in mind and, living your daily life with that idea, I think would encourage you to be a better person. It kind of makes it so that you're not just, what you're doing is not just affecting that other person, it's affecting you. And it's, I think could have a trickle effect on people in general, just how connected we are. So yeah, that's just kind of where I stand right now with it all.
I think that's a great thing. Just focusing on the fact that we're all connected, that we all come from the same stuff, and that even beyond, it is absolutely important to understand your heritage and your ancestry. That's I would always champion that, but also keep in mind through that lens that we're all still connected as one.
Oh,
Uh,
100%.
I think it's one of my favorite questions to end off on. I think it's a great stopping point. You just mentioned the experience that you had fasting for 72 hours, essentially just with water, and that led to a spiritual experience.
Mhm.
One of the core components, the archetypes that make up this platform, Beyond the Well, is the story of Mimir's well and Odin sacrificing his eye at the well in order to obtain knowledge. Being able to make a sacrifice that is so, in his case, so important. He lost half of his eyesight for it. He was willing to sacrifice something so important to his biology and to himself to obtain knowledge. With your psychedelics experience, with your experience as a child growing up in a Christian church, and with all these different experiences that you have traveling all over the world, what is it you feel you've sacrificed to get to where you are now?
That's a very good question. I think one of the big things is realizing that you're not the shit. I think that, a core thing about our ego is wanting yourself to feel like you're the shit, like you're the boss of yourself, like you can do whatever you want, it's like, this is my life, all those things that, kind of get us stuck, you know, and, it's a comfortable place to be, and I mean, it's kind of the whole like ignorance is bliss thing. So I kind of had to give up that and kind of get myself to a place where it's like, it's not all about me. It's not, it's not even remotely about me. It's like, I'm not here to be served, but to serve, and there's a lot of work that goes into serving, when you're self-serving, sure, there may be a lot of work put into, serving your own needs, but when you go out of your way to serve others, that takes effort, but it's a labor of love. So, it's honestly, I feel like the cons of that greatly outweigh the pros greatly outweigh the cons of that. So it's almost like I'm not losing something, but also gaining, it's like you gain something within the loss. So I don't know. That's just kind of how I feel about that.
I totally understand that. It all comes back to love, always does. Well, I want to thank you, Connor, so much for getting on here finally after
Yeah.
5 or 6 years of being told we should do a podcast together. I think it's about time. And I
Well, it's,
very much, yeah, very
well, dude, I
much.
would love to do this again, man. I really would.
Oh, of course. We could talk about these kinds of things for hours. Absolutely. And if you, by any chance, feel inspired to start one up yourself, you always know how to get in contact with me. Thank you so much for being on here. Just for anybody who wants to follow you or wants to know the kind of stuff that you're up to, because you're always up to some wacky stuff, where can people find you on social media or anything like that?
Well, I have an account on Instagram. It's a Truth Extractor, one word. And I have a Facebook, but I don't really use that very much. So if you want to find me, just go on Instagram. I post fun movie stuff and political posts that would make your conservative parents upset.
Always a rabble rouser. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Connor. It was a pleasure, and we'll be hearing from you soon. I have no doubt about that.
Absolutely, brother. Thank you for having me.